Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB Radio or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Avangrid Renewables, Airbnb, McKinley Irvin, AARP, and Uber. Today's program sponsors are Healthcare of All Oregon and Portland Community College. Please show our appreciation for their support. And now on to our program today. Our Friday Forum today is titled #What Doctors Look Like. This is probably the first time in club history that we've used hashtag for a program title. But many of you have probably seen the hashtag What Doctors Look Like, which went viral on social media in the past few weeks. It came out after a recent in-flight incident. Dr. Tamika Cross, a physician and a young black woman, wrote that she was dismissed by the flight crew when she volunteered to tend to a sick patient. Cross's post sparked a tidal wave of social media response about professional discrimination and diversity in healthcare. This informed our conversation today, and we have a wonderful panel of folks to talk about it. Let me tell you about our speakers. We have Dr. David Grunkemeier, who is a GI doc at the Oregon Clinic. We have Dr. Stephanie Maya Lopez, an associate professor of psychiatry and associate director of the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Training Program at OHSU. She's also the president of the Oregon Psychiatric Physicians Association. We have Portland native Nicholas Robbins, who will graduate from OHSU Medical School in 2017. He's specializing in emergency medicine. And finally, our moderator today is Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia. She's executive director of OHSU's Avel Gordly Center for Healing and associate professor of psychiatry. She's also the co-founder of the Capuia Foundation. Please join me in welcoming our moderator and panelists.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here today. You are in for a tremendous treat. I want to go back and give you about 2 minutes of history to kind of frame the conversation for today. And I want to take us back to the Revolutionary War, the Revolution. You're like, why? 1776 to 1783, right? That is the war that basically formed the United States of America. And we know what the basis of that was. It's that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, what was missing out of that at that time? Women and people of color. And I want you to follow. Then we move to the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And the Civil War, it said, is what defined the kind of nation that we would become. Are you following? And in the context of the Civil War, we get the Emancipation Proclamation, but we also get the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which frees slaves. But back in 1862, Lincoln was noted to have said that the Civil War is not about freeing slaves. The Civil War was really about maintaining the Union. And freeing the slaves was really a consequence of that. So then many people would argue the period after the end of the Civil War from 1865 to about 1877, which was Reconstruction, was a period of where people of color and women were socialized to be less than. And moving forward from that, even though slaves were freed with the 13th Amendment, there still was this clause, except for being a criminal. So from the period of 1865 to really up into the civil rights movement of the 1960s, slavery became transformed into criminalization. So then the people of color were then criminalized and then in many ways devalued and dehumanized. And then we get to 1968, where we have a civil rights sort of movement and legislation. We get the death of two critical figures, Martin Luther King Jr. and also Kennedy. And at that time, there was political unrest. The police relations with community was not that great. Racial turmoil was high. Does that sound familiar? That's 1968. We're now in 2016, and we've got the deaths of young black men. We have women still fighting for parity in many areas, and we've got this consistency. I want you to go. I wanted to start with the inception of this country in 1776 because it matters. When we said that all men would be created equal, we didn't include everybody, and still the fight has been to include everyone. So when we get to Tamika Cross, Dr. Cross, what she had to go through at that point on the plane is a culmination of historical events. And so with that being said, there are a number of things that we want to get to today. I wanted to kind of provide that historical context. There are a few questions that I want to start with the panel, because Tamika Cross, as you know, obstetrician gynecologist on the plane.
That you are, but I do know a little bit of history. And one of the things I'd like to talk about history is if we go back to 1910, and we talk about what medical schools were like back in 1910. There was an interest by the American Medical Association to kind of redefine what medical school education was. At that time, they decided to get the Carnegie Foundation to do a report on medical schools, and they hired a person named Andrew Flexner, and he published the Flexner Report. At that particular time, there were 3 women medical schools in the United States. There were 7 predominantly African-American or black medical schools. So 2 things happened out of this Flexner report. Number 1, it was determined that women had just as much equal rights as men at that time, which I think is interesting because it was 10 years before women had the right to vote. So I hardly believe that was the case. But out of that, he determined that we don't need to put money in medical schools for women. They have just as many rights to go to a regular medical school. And you know what? They don't seem to have very much interest in going to medical school. So, you know, we don't need these medical schools for women.
Nicholas, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, and I'm going to say for those of you tuning in today here, listening to OPB, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, and I'm Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, the Executive Director of the Oregon Health and Science University Avel Gordly Center for Healing, and today we are discussing discrimination in the healthcare field with some of our distinguished guests, future Dr. Nicholas Robbins, Dr. David Grunkemeier, and Dr. Stephanie Maya Lopez. Please finish your thought.
So after that, all 3 women medical schools were eliminated. Moving on to African Americans. Out of this report, it was determined that the only purpose for an African American doctor was to treat the poor African Americans that, in the words of the Flexner Report, really was to avoid infecting the poor white people that were their neighbors, and that they needed African American doctors to essentially do this. So they eliminated all but 2 predominantly African American medical schools at that time. Howard and Meharry retained, as well as in the future years, we now have Morehouse Medical School. So skipping forward to today, 100 years later, we have lost essentially what we would have thought of as a diverse population of doctors because of incidents that happened many, many years ago. So the thing that most resonates with me, I guess, is the fact that the flight attendant on the plane that looked at her as somebody that she was not familiar with as being a doctor. And the reason why is because of so many things that have happened in our history that need to be changed. And one of those things is we need to have more women. We need to have more African Americans in medical school so that, while not excusing anything that she did, the community is more familiar with that there is a large, diverse people that should be doctors, that have the ability to be doctors, and that should be recognized as doctors in our community.
Thank you.
I'd actually like to ask a question, actually. Thank you for having me, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicholas, do you think that her inacceptance to be recognized as a physician was more because she was a female or because she was African American?
Yeah, I think that's hard to say. I think there's very good aspects of that. From my perspective, I've seen a lot of patients just in my training that have recognized me as a physician, where I'm not quite a physician yet, but did not recognize one of my resident or attending colleagues as a physician. And you know, going in the room and standing with a female physician colleague, and the patient's directly looking at me as if I was the physician in the room. So I've definitely experienced that, and I think that is a very strong aspect of the bias in this situation. It was not only was she African American, but maybe more so that she was a woman.
So, you want to continue in that vein, or Dr. Maya Lopez, would you like to?
The thing that strikes me most about Dr. Cross's experience is the idea of intersectional identities kind of coming crashing together at what is presumably a fairly tense moment on the plane. And when I thought about that, my guess is, I don't know what motivated this flight attendant to say what she did directly, but in reading the situation, I thought a lot about the unconscious bias that was happening in that moment. I don't think most people wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to make a racist, sexist statement that is going to go explode all over the media. I think it's something that came out in the moment. And for me, that caused me to think, well, what do we do about that? And you know, my thought is that we have to consciously challenge our own biases, and in order to practice for those moments when the unconscious bias occurs. Maybe we can head it off at the pass.
So this would be an example of implicit bias.
Yes. Yes.
So, you know, my thoughts upon this subject are, when we think about implicit bias, thinking about things that we internalize, we have internalized, but we don't necessarily express. So, for example, you know, Tamika Cross is a woman, and she's also an African-American physician. But on that particular day, you know, do the flight attendants, do they recognize her as a female, as an African-American, or somebody who cannot be a physician because of her ethnicity and her race?
And I think that those are all really interesting points. Since we're on the topic of unconscious bias, I want to give an example. Have any of you ever been in a car and you sort of heard a song and you're like, oh, didn't think anything of it, and then you find yourself 2 weeks later humming the tune of the song? Yes? No? Yes. It happens. That's very much sort of like this unconscious bias process. Our unconscious processes are fed by the environment and the things around us. So if I'm in an environment where the expectation is always the soft bigotry of low expectation, even though it's not what you say, it's what's felt. So I feel it more than what is stated. And it's interesting because that's why I wanted to give the history of the country and who it included and who it did not, because this socialization that then dictates behavior, and it doesn't even have to be stated, it's what's felt, turns out that it's powerful. Can you all respond to that sentiment? Anyone on the panel? Dr. Lopez, you leaning forward. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, boy. Well, I really don't have anything to say about that particular thing in the moment.
So I would say a perfect example, as I was thinking about this subject for myself, you know, implicit bias. So where do I fit in on the scale, and where does society fit in? So as an example, I would say when I see someone who's disabled, I automatically assume that there's something I can do for that particular individual. How can I help open the door? But the other way to look at this would be, you know, why am I feeling that way? What about this person in this society where we, you know, do we shun disabled people? Do we think that all of them need our help and assistance? And yet I offer it, but perhaps this person doesn't want me to do that. So that would just be a simple example that I think all of us can relate to. How can we position ourselves as a society to think differently? And it's a communal. I mean, we have to accept the fact that we're all different, but there's a bigger picture. We're all part of the same human experience.
I think that one thing about the implicit bias issue is that there's this concept of the interloper. Dr. Cross was treated as an interloper, someone who did not belong in that particular setting doing what she did. And if you want to talk about history, Latinos have a very frank conception in the media and in American societies as interlopers. If you understand the history of Mexican Americans in this country, you will know that many people did not actually cross a border to come to the United States. Half of the entire territory of Mexico was annexed by the United States. And my own family became United States citizens, not by crossing a border, but because the border crossed over to us. But the idea, when I get asked, when did your family come to the United States? I laugh because I think, know your history, because I'm not an interloper. And then you start thinking, well, the people who come to this country, are they interlopers? Then who is the interloper? It's a bizarre question, frankly.
So then that leads to another point. We're talking about sort of the intersections of gender, race, professionalism, class, if you will. We live in a time right now where, even given the history of people of color where it has not always been favorable, you could be the President of the United States and the President of the Harvard Law Review and still be subject to some of the very tough, racist, bigoted ideas in the country. And so when you think of a Tamika Cross, and her statement was, "I'm tired of being disrespected," right? So I want, in that to me, there's this sense of invisibility, being made to feel invisible or like you don't count. So I'd like each of you to maybe reflect on a time where you felt like you were made to feel invisible and you did not count, and what was your response to that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. That's a great question. So I'll give you a perfect example of sort of a monthly experience in my practice. The only African-American physician in my practice. As a gastroenterologist, we're doing procedures, so I'm often in the procedural suite, and I'll meet the patient there for the first time. And the patient, I'm at the computer typing something about the patient that's coming in or about the previous patient, and the patient may come in head first, so they're looking at me, or the opposite, back first. It just depends on which end we're working on. So, you know, monthly, if not, you know, twice a month or so, and most recently, I'll give you a perfect example. I had a patient who, here I am, I've got my white coat on, my white coat, I've got my name badge, my embroidered scrubs, and maybe 3 weeks ago, a woman turned around to see me. I had not met her before, and I introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Dr. Grant Kumar, I'll be doing your procedure." And she said, "Oh, I thought you were the orderly." And so, you know, like I said, it's not uncommon, but specifically for that example, I said, you know, you're only a few years older than I am, and I mean, do orderlies still exist? You know, I don't remember that term. It's like a candy striper. You know, and I mean, all of a sudden I was taken back to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where the orderlies were African American, wearing a white outfit. And so, you know, in my own practice, I'm very frequently made to feel as if I'm somebody not of the standing that I am. And, you know, I guess that would be my most recent but ongoing example of that.
And how do you manage that?
Sorry.
How do you manage that?
Well, I think for myself, I just recognize that most people haven't seen an African-American physician. I think that that's probably, you know, but it's true here, where I did my fellowship and then was on faculty at North Carolina. there were a lot of African Americans of a higher, status. I didn't have to be the guy coming to transport the patient from one room to the other. I could be a physician. They didn't know who I was. Last week, I was in the emergency room and I saw a woman, and I opened the door, and again, scrubs, white coat, name badge that clearly says doctor, and she said, aha, here is the person who's going to transport me, she said it, to my room, and then recognized right away that I was the physician. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. But, I just say, well, these are just people that haven't seen physicians, and I think that's where the self-empowerment comes in. How do we project ourselves in a way of identity? How can we project a sense of excellence and purpose and education and high-rising achievement and so on? How do we do that? I can't even do it in my own practice.
Thank you for that. And for those of you listening on OPB, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, and we're talking about discrimination in the healthcare field. I'm joined by Nicholas Robbins, Dr. David Grunkemeier, and Dr. Stephanie Maya Lopez. Continuing on with our theme, Dr. Lopez, might you talk about a time that you were made to feel invisible?
Sure. And I also want to make the comment that it's remarkable that this person thought you were the orderly and not the nurse, which really speaks to the complex hierarchies we place upon our perceptions of people in the healthcare field. I more often have gotten mistaken for the nurse, which has occurred many times, and that is a type of invisibility. I have gotten mistaken for a nurse even when I've specifically introduced myself as Dr. Stephanie Lopez, clearly, with my white coat and my stethoscope. There are other kinds of invisibility, though. In medical school, there is a thing called rounding, and the group of medical students and residents and the attending physician walk from patient to patient room, and it's teaching and walking and teaching. But there's also a lot of socialization that goes on as well. So they'll ask you what you like to do for fun, and sometimes the conversation gets to things like what the weekend was like at the golf course, which if you go to a golf course, you don't see a lot of people of color at the golf course. That's changing, but it's still somewhat true. And those kinds of conversations shut the diverse people out of that conversation. And then 5 minutes later, when you're asked a question about medicine, it becomes really hard to feel like you're part of the group and answer that bravely and boldly, because you've already been marginalized. That was a very common experience.
Nicholas?
So being the person with the least professional experience as a physician this far, I can't really think of incidents thus far. But what I'd like to do is maybe share with you something from my childhood. And I wasn't always quite this skin color. I used to be a little bit darker, and I used to have, hair that you could barely put a comb through. So I was much more recognizable as an African American when I was a little younger. And I went to a private school here in Portland, and I was the only minority in the entire school. And so growing up, I very much felt invisible to my classmates, and I really felt very invisible socially within my school. Being ostracized and kind of put out, during games for being a person that just looks different is really something that hurt as a kid. And it's something that, while I've got past that as an adult, when I see these type of events that occur, it really hits home with me, because I know what it's like to sit alone, and I know what it's like to be treated differently just because of how you look. And it went to the point to where I eventually had to change the school because the kids literally try to make me invisible by painting me.
Can I follow up on something? Because what you have to say about your appearance really hits close to home for me too, because there's another kind of invisibility that happens, which is if you're Latina or Latino and you have light skin, people don't think you're Latino or Latina, and some people feel very free to say much more openly racist and biased things in your presence. And that has happened to me a fair amount, and that is a different kind of invisibility because it hurts. And at that point, I speak up, but even then, the remarks continue. It's remarkable how much weight we put into a person's physical appearance.
Thank you for that. You know, as you all were reflecting, I was thinking I want to take us all back to kindergarten when we sort of learned which of these things is not like the other. You probably remember a Sesame Street episode like that as well. And so as kindergartners, at some point, we were all socialized to look at what's different. And as kindergartners, as we were socialized to look at what was different, we weren't really given context for that difference. So then what happens is you become adults who look at difference with no context. And that's where we find ourselves today, which is most unfortunate. So to that end, I want to ask the panel, sort of in a fire round, what's our collective responsibility as professionals to help give context to that difference? Quickly, come on. You want me to answer my own question too? Because I can do that.
Well, I mean, this right here is an example. Being vocal, being who you are, and wearing it on your sleeve. Whatever that background is, and making sure that the people around you know you're not invisible. Sometimes it takes speaking up a little louder than the people around you to accomplish that, and that's something that I think many of us here have had to practice that our entire professional lives and continue to work on.
I would say self-promotion, but specifically germane to what we're talking about is promoting excellence. We're all here because we're in a position of excellence, and therefore, indirectly a position of authority. And I think projecting a sense of importance and authority and excellence to our peers, to our neighbors, to those in our community who may not be like us, I think it's a very, very important contribution that we can make.
Yeah, I would echo that and also say advocacy, and also making sure that as a person who's in these positions, that it's an open discussion with your community, with whoever you're working for, your local city clubs, and even on a larger scale. One of the things I've thought about with kind of all the things that we've been seeing lately, and especially with Dr. Cross, is who's going to address these issues, and then thinking, well, that's me. I'm here to address these issues. So, when I'm a physician, wherever I'm I'm going to address these issues with my colleagues. I'm going to address these with the administrators at the hospital and make sure that I don't sit down and be quiet on these issues, that this is something that we have to be vocal about, and we have to know, we have to let people know how important it is to everybody.
Another great point. I also honestly believe that systems have to change, and that systems are intimately attached to people, and that people have to change, but people don't change unless they feel something. So we get back to that feeling thing that drives that unconscious process, right? That unconscious bias. What can we do at the people level? Dr. Lopez.
We all have bias, no matter who we are and what our ethnic identity is, whatever race, or whatever category we fit in society. And one of the things that this talk has really stimulated me to think about is consciously challenging my bias and making sure that I am open to possibility, and making sure that the people around me are open to the possibility that I am a physician, I am a psychiatrist, I'm a forensic psychiatrist, which is a very narrow specialty, and making sure that people understand that.
I would say, I would add to that, having dialogue, I think, is the most important aspect to myself. We were just talking before the program about, you know, in my opinion, in this country, we don't talk enough about the things that really matter. We don't talk about politics. We often don't talk about race. And these are just with people you know. You know, how many of you talk with your next door neighbor about who you're voting for? I mean, these are very, very important, you know, aspects of our daily lives that probably matter more than anything else. And this is something that we just don't communicate about. So I think conversation and dialogue between people are just very, you know, it's very important. Especially, you know, obviously people who are outside our social circles. I think innately, you know, probably from an evolutionary standpoint, you know, like tends to go with like. You know, if you weren't in my clan, you were outside of my clan. You were competing for resources and food and breeding rights and so on. And so probably these biases go back to an evolutionary standpoint, but they have no role in today's modern time. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, our biases against disabled people and biases against women and biases against people of color and professionals of color. I mean, I just think that this is something that conversation and dialogue and reaching outside of our own social circles or comfort circles is very important.
Can I just add one thing, which is people are afraid of vitriol. They're afraid to bring these things up because these things are sensitive personal topics with strong feelings. The more that you practice these conversations, the easier they get and the more productive they become.
So the last thing I would say is not only is it important to start a dialogue, but it's also important to make sure that we follow it through, because lots of times these conversations are started and then somewhere down the road they drop off and nobody's keeping their eye on it. And so not only should you start it, but you should also ask some tough questions along the way to people who have committed to changing this problem. And these questions should feel uncomfortable at times. And if you're not asking questions about what's being done, and who's looking at the fact that maybe we don't have enough women in this institution or people of color in this institution, then you're not asking the right questions a lot of the time.
And I think you're absolutely right there. Most of the time we'll ask the question, who's man in the store? You know, and you see something and you'll say, I wonder if somebody else will handle that. And what I'm actually challenging everyone in this room to do today is to assume some responsibility and to be the person that says, I'm going to step up and do something about it. I'll share very, very briefly. When I was actually a medical student at George Washington University, we serve a wide spectrum of folks. So you have the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. And I happened to be serving someone who was sort of the upper echelon at that point. And I walked into the room, and this person said to me, "Oh, you must be the help." And yeah, are you just as exasperated as I was? So you must be the help. And I froze in the moment because I wanted to respond in my emotional sort of frustrated mind, but I had to go to wise mind and to say, this is someone who is here to receive help, and this is also an opportunity for me to teach. Now, in that moment, I was hurt and felt wounded, but I also had the expectation or the burden placed on me to be the teacher in that moment. And I want you to think about the positions that places many of us in, where we are human. But if you are socialized to believe that the folks that you are dealing with are not human, are subhuman, don't have feeling, don't have emotions, then these unrealistic expectations are placed on you. So in the moment, I had to kind of suck it up, have a conversation with this person, and help, and to be very helpful in the moment. Then when I walked out of the room, I'm like, your life just got saved because I'm the best student here. Yeah, you can clap for that. So anyway, but the point of that is that I feel like when we talk about a Tamika Cross and the burden that she carries and the burden that sometimes we carry, we do have a collective responsibility to do something about it. Once you know about it, you have to do something about it. So with that, I want to ask this lightning round sort of question. I want you all to reflect on a quote, because it's not all bad. I think that there is definitely hope. And to that end, Martin Luther King says, we must accept infinite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. I'd like you all to reflect on that quickly. And we'll start with you, Nicholas.
I know, that's it's such a great quote. Yeah, I think that, you know, for one, we have to definitely make sure that we continue everything that we've started here. And like Dr. Moreland-Capuia said, charging everybody with, you know, taking this under your wing and making sure that these are important topics that discussed going forward.
To me, I take away from that quote, it's more important to be the eternal optimist than the eternal pessimist. And I think that's something that was instilled in me a great deal by my mom. And so always hoping that tomorrow will be better, and more importantly, creating a better tomorrow by making a change.
Sure, there is an infinite hope. If you try to imagine even this scenario here today, 50 years ago, it wouldn't have occurred. And the numbers are changing in medical school. Dr. Moreland-Capuia told me this morning that the incoming class is 15% Latino. Is that the right number? Something significant. And what we can do is we can all reach out and help each other up, because the people you see here on the panel are real survivors of microaggressions, daily microaggressions, every day of their lives. They know how to navigate the system, and you, many of you out here, you know how to navigate the system. Bring other people along with you. That's where the hope lies.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that was, yeah, Dr. Lopez for president there, yeah? For those of you listening on OPB, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Dr. Moreland-Capuia, and I think that I was supposed to go to Q&A. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Yes, okay, so I'm going to do that too. So let's now go to the audience for some questions. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for staff to collect, and I will read at least one index card. And we invite City Club members, if you are a member, to ask your questions at the microphone. And asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club being a member. Please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask one question, get this, in 30 seconds or less. I think you can do it.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation today. I'm Courtney Nelson, City Club member. I wanted to go back to the thing you said. I'm a new mom. I have a 7-month-old daughter, and so trying to think very thoughtfully and intentionally about what it means to raise a daughter in this day and age. And so this conversation has really been really interesting to me. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this kindergarten, one of these things is not like the other, and how to think about that and how to provide the right context. Just kind of talk a little bit more about that idea. That'd be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think that what's the context is the tough conversations that, yes, red is different from blue, and what does that have to do with our underlying humanity? So I think that if we could move forward to teaching our children about the process of empathy and humanity, the better that we will do. And that empathy is something that develops over time, right? Teaching kindness, even despite the difference. How do we love people, and how do we continue to serve people even when they are different? And that the difference is a strength and not a weakness. And there's a larger conversation about that, but that is the quick answer. Did you want to respond? And then we want to get to as many questions as we can. So one of you, yep, go ahead.
I would add to that that another important thing is modeling not just tolerance, but appreciation and understanding. I don't like the word tolerance because it's not good enough. I was fortunate to grow up in an environment where my family intentionally exposed me to many different situations, people, and places, and my mother not only tolerated people, but loved people of all kinds. And it is a really, that is the best way to teach your children.
Thank you.
So you all have been talking about intersectionality of all of the facets of who we are. And this fall on the ballot, we're also looking at whether there should be a change in mandatory retirement age for judges. And I'm just wondering, in your profession, as you look ahead at being of a certain age in your profession, do you think that's going to make it better for you in terms of how you feel about being respected, and is that something unique for professions like law or medicine or?
You know, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I've thought a lot about that, especially since moving to Portland and practicing medicine here. I'm originally from San Diego, and then came up for residency here, and then went to Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and then back to Portland. So I've kind of moved around a little bit within the context of my profession. And, you know, I thought at first, being a little older, just physically being older, shaving my head gives me a little appearance of wisdom and so on. But I haven't found that actually to be true. And I think my own perspective is before, you know, people would see age in me, my goatee turns gray and so on, my eyebrows get thick and bushy in my ears. Before people see that, they're still going to see my skin color. And I think from my perspective, you know, that is just the one thing that is very different about this country than other countries, other Western countries. I mean, we still very much first see skin color before we see anything else. So, you know, I'm optimistic that as my child gets older and he's my age and moving forward, we will have had enough generations behind us and time since, you know, my parents, I'm actually a child of an interracial marriage, and, you know, when my parents got married, 13 states allowed interracial marriages, Virginia versus Loving, 1967, so they were married shortly after that. So we still need some time, but we can't be idle. We have to educate the next generation.
I'm Liz Rance. I'm a City Club member, and I'm also a physician. And I'm struck listening to this discussion that there's another bias running through here, that somehow physicians are better. We're higher. You know, we're better than the nurses. And I think that's something that being an older doc, I have learned. We really have to address. We're all quality human beings providing health care, and it's not that we're at the top of the chain.
Go ahead and go straight down. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I would say in my training, I believe OHSU has done an exceptional job at what we call collaboration between the other specialties. And I know as a young physician, I much appreciate the opinions of the different specialties and the different, you know, nursing specialties, PAs, nurse practitioners, techs, surgical techs. You know, any aspect can bring a very important perspective to patient care, and I think that's absolutely correct, that we don't just be biased as physicians and think we're better than anybody else, and know that a lot of people can add important topics to the conversation.
Go ahead, Dr. Lopez.
I'll make it quick. The fact that I get mistaken for a nurse says a lot about the hierarchy of medicine and healthcare today that is changing, I like to think. And the fact that when I was going to enter nursing school, one of my mentors said, no, you should be a doctor. Really was very striking to me at the time, and it still resonates because we really do need to be continuing to be collaborators in care rather than being a hierarchical structure.
Okay, I'm actually going to go to a card, one of the questions on the card. What advice do you have to preserve the mental health of trainees in any field who come from intersecting marginalized communities? Do we find comfort in our small identified groups or risk fatigue having to be the first, in quotes, pushing against a glass ceiling? Great question.
I'm not sure I actually physically heard all of that, but
you didn't hear all of it.
What I think I heard, I would like to comment on.
Okay.
If that's
well,
okay.
Okay.
Let me know if I get it right.
Be hit or miss?
No,
okay.
I think it's a great question. It's very germane to what we're talking about today, obviously. I think the way I look at this, the way I internalize this issue is, again, we're all part of our own individual groups, but the bigger issue is, how can we see ourselves in others? And I think this gets back to, for me, one of the kids is doing his own thing, one of the kids is not the same. It's great. Teach your child about individuality, celebrate their strengths, but also teach them to see themselves in others. It's very important. You have to be able to do that. So for myself, I think that's how I would answer that.
Nick, I'd like everyone to actually respond to this question. So,
I think there are two comments I have about that. Number one, do not be alone. Find safe places and safe people and connect with them and maintain those connections. The second thing I have to say that I learned later, and it gets back to the title of this talk, is I had to realize I did look like a doctor. I didn't think I looked like a doctor when I was starting back at school and was going to go into nursing. And when somebody taught me what a doctor does, I went, wow, I really want to do that. But I don't look like a doctor. And practice, looking like whatever profession it is you are in or you are want to go in. And that means, doesn't mean how you dress, it means who you are. Any one of you looks like a doctor. And you really need to understand that the diversity is here already in front of you.
I would definitely say that this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm about to go into residency, so I'm looking at different programs all around the country, and the thought is, do I want to go to a place where I have a large number of African-American physicians, or the program is very diverse and I'm taking care of a diverse population of patients where I feel very comfortable and I have those kind of supports and I have people that are interested in the same things? Or, do I find myself at a program that maybe needs to work on this? And I guess the thing I would say is don't be afraid, because sometimes you will be put in that situation. And so don't be afraid to be put in that sort of situation where you do have to go somewhere to help. And maybe you will have to find other ways in your life to get the comfort that you need, even though it may not be the perfect situation.
Well, it sort of goes back to my initial point that I made, sort of being, having broken wings and still expected to fly. It feels almost impossible. It's like being expected to climb a mountain and move it at the same time. So let's just be very clear that being a trainee and having to educate folks on, or being the first to kind of move a process forward, it is challenging. And so I believe that that's where there's a role for mentors and securing them outside of the institution, to having a safe space and place where you can go and sort of process what you're going through and feelings and things like that. But I also want to validate the fact that it is a real phenomenon, and getting some additional resources on the outside is super helpful. That would be the piece of advice that I would give. And we'll go to the next question here.
Thank you. Carol Witherell, City Club member. I'll begin my question with something of a confessional. When I was teaching in the fields of education and psychology, I thought I knew a lot about race, ethnicity, and issues of racial, ethnic, and economic justice. And it wasn't until I retired in 2005 that I started getting involved in workshops on racial relations and on white privilege and on economic inequality and most of all, looking at my own implicit bias and what I grew up with, and addressing that, owning it, and realizing it's a lifetime project for me. I participated in race talks here in the city, and I'm very involved with Ending the New Jim Crow. And those are two organizations that have really helped me build better relationships and address my own bias. And I'm wondering what other organizations in Portland or in the surrounding area you might have either been involved with or that you know about that could help us draw together as we form the kind of diverse community that we want to be.
Do you want to? Well, I think that, you know, asking for an organization or an institution, yeah, okay, thank you, got it. Asking for an organization, you know, is important, and I mean, we could probably name a few, but I think the point that we'd like to try to drive home today is that it's really the conversations at the kitchen table that change people's behavior. And so we're hoping that these conversations that we started here right now today, that you would take them to your kitchen table, maybe over Thanksgiving, and say, hey, what do you think about that? Because that's where real change happens. Change happens when people feel something. Change happens when we understand that there's a universality in our fear, in our pain, in our struggle, and that we all converge at that place. So what I'm asking you to do, I know you're asking something of us, but I'm going to ask something of you, that you take the spirit, the essence of this conversation to your dinner table, and then join us again for part 2 and 3, which I'm predicting will happen. No? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Walter.
Walter Robinson II, City Club member. We've been speaking a lot about identity, and I know it's something we joke about, but in all seriousness, you've all earned letters on the end of your name that have put letters in the front of your name. So how do you, in your day-to-day interactions, use those letters in the front of your name when interacting with people so that instances like this don't happen? So I'm thinking, you know, even from the rooms you're in the medical field, as well as just being at your, you know, neighborhood-friendly Walgreens. So how does that look, and what does that interaction look like?
Great question. For myself in my personal practice, I think, and it's probably just my own personal style, but I'm pretty gregarious, and I like to conversate and talk to my patients and get to know them. So I think the first thing is I break down some barriers by just communicating, getting to talk to the person as an individual, the patient, but also letting them hear a little bit about my background. You know, I heard from it's interesting, this is so apropos to what I go through, I think, every day. Just the other, it was probably 2 weeks ago, one of the medical assistants told me that one of the patients who was going to be my patient, but ended up for different reasons not, said, well, I actually would have felt very comfortable with Dr. Grunkemeier as my physician because I know nobody gave him anything. He had to work for everything that he got. And again, just an offhand comment, but well, it would have been great to have had that person as a patient to get to talk to them, let them know, you know, some things I did have easy and other things I didn't. You know, don't necessarily project your biases on me because of the way I look for that reason. So for myself, I start this process by just communicating and conversating. And again, I think my sense here is, you know, what do we have in common? I think let's build that as our strength, as our foundation, more than what we have, what we're different, how we're different. You know, what are our differences? Don't focus on the discrepancies. We're alike in a lot of ways. So I think for myself, that's what I would say.
This may or may not be directly related, but the last couple of times a patient refused to see me because of my last name, I went out to the waiting room and found that person and said, excuse me, I'm Dr. Lopez, can we talk? And in both of those cases, the patient agreed to come in and see me. I'm still not sure what kind of thinking went behind that, but I did use my leverage as a physician to go out there and convince that person that they need to come and be at the table with me. The other thing is, as a psychiatrist, is when I get these comments like, do you speak English? Oh, thank God you speak English. I've wanted a doctor who speaks English. I say, in my psychiatrist voice, well, why do you ask that? Why are you saying that? And it's the start of a conversation.
Thank you.
Mary Lou Iverson, and I'm a City Club member, and you pretty much kind of answered my question, just answered my question, but mine was, you've told us how you feel when a new patient makes a comment, looks at you and makes a comment, but how do you suppress looking at a patient and not making a comment or not letting your first impression cloud your investigation or your review of that patient?
So I think that just comes down to the fact that you care for your patients, and even if they may look at you in a wrong way, or even if they make something, make a comment that you don't necessarily agree with, I always kind of put myself in the context of, at least in what I'm going into is emergency medicine, and the patients are very sick. But even if I was in another profession, another specialty, that their care is the most important thing at that time, and we do have to have a conversation. We do have to communicate. Lots of times, you need to spend a little bit more time getting rapport with that patient, but ultimately the focus is on their care first, and then maybe trying to get a better communication going between doctor and patient second.
Hi, Melissa Magana, City Club member. So often we talk about cultural competency when talking about healthcare. Can you speak briefly about how diversifying our doctors can better help us serve patients?
Yeah, I'll speak to that briefly. So when I was working in the child psychiatry department doing my rotation, when parents would come in, the first question they would ask me is, do you have children? And the reason they would ask me that question is because they wanted to know that there are some things that they wouldn't have to explain, that there are some things that would be automatic, that would be shared, there'd be a automatic shared understanding. And when I would say to them, yeah, I have children, there was just a sigh of relief, like, oh, thank goodness. So there's some things that you automatically understand because you're a parent too. Well, I want to juxtapose that to culturally specific care. That's how it feels. That very same feeling, that very sigh of relief, that there's some automatic shared understanding, automatically helps people get on the path to recovery and healing because they feel understood. And all human beings at the base, we want to be connected and we want to be understood. That's what culturally specific care provides, and that's what improves the quality of care. So that was the last question that we're going to take. Was that the last question, Sam? Okay, that was our last question. We want to thank you.
We are out of broadcast time for today. If this program has inspired you to join City Club, we do, of course, have envelopes and staff in the back of the room. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. Please join me in thanking Sam Metz and Daniel Capuia for our program today and this amazing panel, and they're thoughtful. Thanks for being here today.